Thank you. I'd like to call to order the December 15th meeting of the Community Development, Housing and General Government Committee meeting. Like to say good afternoon to everyone. And due to the safer at home order, all committee members are participating virtually. For virtual meetings, committee members will be muted until asked to be heard. When there is a vote, it will be necessary to take a roll call vote. A committee member will be recognized, raise their hand, and state their vote. The committee members of the Community Development, Housing, and General Government are Councilmember Annette Scipio, Vice Chair, Councilmember Robert Clark, and Councilmember Kevin Monday, as well as myself, Mayor Pro Tem Denise Adams. Councilmember Clark, I don't know whether he's on the call on the meeting yet. He's going to be a little late. But we will go ahead and proceed. Will the clerk please, we have 3 consent items and we have 1 general agenda item. And will the clerk please call the first item?
Mayor Pro Tem, do you want to take the vote for to see if anybody would like to pull the consent?
You are so correct. Are there any items that need to be pulled from the consent agenda or any, because we did cover one of them yesterday or 2 of them. Do we have anyone that would like to discuss any of the following?
Madam Chair, I would appreciate a briefing on C1.
If there are no others, may I get a motion to approve the balance of the consent agenda?
I move to approve the balance of the consent agenda.
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded to approve the balance of the consent agenda. We will have the roll call vote. Vice Chair Annette Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Monday.
Aye.
Councilmember Clark. Councilmember Adams votes yes, and the motion passes. Thank you. Madam City Clerk, now we can move to calling the first item, C1.
Item C1, a text amendment proposed by Planning and Development Services staff to amend Section 12.2 of the Unified Development Ordinance relating to traffic impact study standards, UDO CC6.
Who's going to respond to this? Is it Mr. King or?
Mayor Pro Tem, good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem and council members. David Reed on our staff is going to give a very brief summary of this item. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Reed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams and members of the committee. The Traffic Impact Study, or TIS, helps Transportation Department determine the impact of large developments on our street system. There is currently TIS requirements in the UDO, but they're specifically for non-residential rezonings. Since it was adopted in 2001, the requests for these have evolved, and studies are routinely requested and submitted for all types of projects that warrant a TIS. This amendment is intended to reconcile the UDO language with the current practices. The Planning Board held a public hearing on November 12th and recommended approval of the amendment, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Councilmember Larson?
Is this what's being voted on right now is just to establish a public hearing on January 4th? Is that what this is? And at that time, there will be maybe a more comprehensive explanation of what the differences are between the existing ordinance and what's being proposed.
Councilmember Larson, this will come to you for a final vote. The committee will make a recommendation and send this up to the full council for a vote in January. If there's additional clarification that staff can offer now, David's glad to go in a little deeper on this if you'd like.
Okay, so this comment about public hearing January 4th, 2021, it's in the consent agenda right now. What does that mean? Is there a public hearing on January 4th?
Correct.
And at that time, I presume there will be a comprehensive briefing of this document. It's a fairly dense document.
Mr. Reed and Mr. King, could you give a small synopsis of what this is
What
know,
changes? I'm
what
mostly,
we're changing. What is the basic understanding of the change?
Yeah, the language is pretty lengthy because the Transportation Department wanted all the details of what's required for a TIS included in the language. But basically, the changes to what has been in there since 2001 are that originally the TIS was only required for non-residential developments that were going through rezoning. So really the key change is that it would include large residential developments that trigger a TIS, and it would also include items going to the planning board that aren't going through rezoning. So now our Winston-Salem DOT will be able to ask for this type of study to be done in those cases. They do that now, but it would codify it in the ordinance that the developers could now look at the ordinance and understand they'll be required to do a TIS for all types of large developments that warrant one.
Councilmember Larson, to add a little bit to what David said, one of the frequent complaints we get on the regulatory side is if our DOT staff says we need this study and somebody says, show me where it says that, and we don't have it in our ordinance, that's a problem. What this does is it closes that loophole. And as you can see in David's staff report, we're pretty much the only large community that doesn't require a TIS for large residential development. So it basically plugs that hole, and now it formalizes what really has been our policy all along. So when somebody asks, where does it say that, we now point to this language and we say, this is where it says that, and this is why we need the study.
so what this, to be clear about understanding this, what this says is that the traffic impact studies now will apply universally to all rezoning cases, residential or commercial.
That meet that standard, yes.
Yeah, meet the standards. So in fact, it's a protective device for the citizens regarding traffic impact to their neighborhoods.
Correct. And staff felt this was important because as you've dealt with True Lion and as Councilmember McIntosh dealt with on Arbor Acres, traffic in existing city streets continues to come up more and more frequently. And we felt like this is a hole that we had currently in our policies, and it helps to put us on better footing as we continue to deal with those issues of traffic going forward.
Thank you for that explanation. That helps a lot, and I appreciate you plugging the hole.
Thank you, Councilmember Larson. I think after the past year and a half we heard the community. And, staff realized when they went doing the process that was something that was lacking, that what it does, as you said, is it makes our citizens feel more confident in the process that their voices are going to be heard before there is a vote or anything on these types of projects that could impact their communities. Are there any more comments from any council members or committee members? If there are none, could I get a motion to approve item C1?
I move to approve item C1.
I'll second.
It has been moved and properly seconded item consent agenda item C1. We will now do the roll call. All Councilmember Vice Chair Scipio.
Yes.
Councilmember Clark. Councilmember Monday.
Aye.
And Mayor Pro Tem Adams, yes. The motion has been moved and approved 3-0. Could we move to City Clerk to the next item, which is the only item on our general agenda?
Item G1, ordinance amending Chapter 4 and Chapter 6 of the Unified Development Ordinance to revise bonus density for affordable housing provisions and to revise alternative parking and parking incentives, UDO CC7.
Is this Mr. King or?
Mayor Pro Tem Tiffany White on our staff is on board, and she is ready to make a presentation on this item.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. White.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Adams and council members. My name is Tiffany White. I'm a project planner with Planning and Development Services, and I'm here tonight to do a presentation on UDO CC7. Okay, yes, screen sharing. Awesome. Thank you so much. So UDO-CC 7, the petitioner is Planning and Development Services staff, and our request is to amend the Unified Development Ordinance's bonus density for affordable housing provision and alternative parking incentives. Next slide, please. Just some background. As part of our 2020-2021 work program, planning staff was asked to review the UDO bonus density for affordable housing provision, which has been in the UDO since its inception in 1994 and never been used. In addition, the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Housing Study and Needs Assessment also recommended reevaluation of this provision to see whether modifications could encourage its use. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background. Currently, the provision allows for the following. For duplex or multifamily units, there's a 25% density bonus if 40% of the units are set aside for residents making less than 60% AMI, or if 20% of the units are reserved for residents making less than 50% AMI. On the single family residential side, there's a 25% density bonus if 25% of the units are sold or rented to residents making less than 80% AMI. Next slide, please. As part of the work that we did on this, we reached out to local affordable housing developers and the Housing Authority of Winston-Salem to get some feedback on the current provision and to see if they had any suggested changes to make it more usable. We also spoke to the city's Community Development Department to review this provision, since several of the regulatory aspects of the provision were actually handled through the Community Development Department or through the Forsyth County Housing and Development Department. And we also researched bonus density provisions in peer communities, both to ensure that we were in a line with what other peer communities were doing as far as bonus density, and to look for any innovative practices that might be going on elsewhere. Next slide, please. So according to the developers that we spoke with, bonus density can be a useful tool, but it's not been an incentive for inclusion of affordable units in our local market. And that has to do with several factors that I outlined in my staff report, including the fact that we just don't have the population density locally to make it necessary to have bonus density programs. In addition to that, our land isn't scarce or expensive enough to really make this an incentive for use. The developers said that for our local market, that the real drivers for affordability included things like changes to stormwater regulation, waived or reduced system development fees, direct municipal funding, all of which are outside the scope and purview of the UDO and what we enforce through the UDO. The developers did say that in general, bonus density provisions are a good tool to have. It's just our local market right now isn't really conducive to their utilization. And both the Community Development Department and HAWS identified some ordinance language that needed to be updated to reflect current HUD policies and local provisions, such as the city's workforce housing policy. And again, that was in the part of the ordinance that really dealt with the regulatory aspects of enforcement. Next slide, please. One of the other things that we did was we talked to developers, and we did some additional research about other potential incentives for inclusion of affordable housing. And we found that one of them was including a reduction in parking requirements as a way to boost housing affordability. In looking at other provisions in other communities and doing some research on how that would be impacted in our local community, we determined that allowing parking reductions for multifamily units within a quarter-mile of legacy growth corridor or activity centers, and also within a quarter-mile of transit, would further multiple planning goals that we have been working on over the past couple of years. Such developments would only require one parking space per unit, regardless of unit size, which would significantly reduce development costs that are put towards parking and the land area needed for that development, and hopefully have the effect of reducing the overall development costs and therefore the rental or sale costs of such units. Next slide, please. We held a public hearing in October 2020 with the planning board, and they unanimously recommended approval of UDO CC7. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. White. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? Vice Chair Scipio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a couple of questions. If we require, I understand the reduction of a parking space per unit as an incentive to developers. But once that happens, you have on the flip side, residents and neighbors complaining that there's not adequate parking. And so on one side, it makes good sense for the developer, but how do we compensate? Because more families have multiple cars. And so I see that as a major issue going forward. And I wonder what the discussion was around that recommendation.
Yeah, I think that we discussed just that balance. How do we balance, furthering the goal of reducing building costs through a reduction in parking while also meeting the need that the developers or the residents might have for parking. And I think that what we landed on is there are going to be market drivers that drive how much parking this needs. In my report, I talked about, for people who use low-income housing tax credits, there's a requirement there that they have 2 spaces per unit. And so, there are other drivers in the market that might do that. What we felt was we didn't want to be the barrier. So if there is a way that the developer, whoever that might be, can make an attractive product with this reduced amount of parking because it's on transit, because they have parking for bikes or motorcycles, however they are able to do that. We just didn't want to be the barrier. If they can make it work, we wanted to be able to allow them to make it work, and we didn't have that tool in our toolbox. So I think that's how we landed. There's nothing against them adding more units or more parking spaces if that's what their market analysis requires. We just wanted to give them the opportunity to reduce that number in order to reduce those development costs if they wanted it.
And Councilmember Scipio, I'll add a little bit to what Tiffany said. She's spot on with that. When we got into this and we quickly realized offering more density, more bonus density was not really going to move the needle, then one of the things we as staff said is there a different way to sort of encourage this? Is it, reduce setbacks, more building height, reduce parking? The parking item that's in this text amendment is the one that we felt most comfortable with. It lines up with kind of where parking trends are going nationally. It lines up with what we've done with previous parking text amendments to the UDO. And it really, again, as we start thinking about affordable housing, it's thinking about trying to get that closer to transit so that hopefully there's an opportunity for folks to have housing, whereas they're not required to own a car where they can utilize transit to save on some of those housing and transportation costs. So Tiffany's spot on, but that's kind of how this sort of showed up in this text amendment as another tool to help us put us on better footing.
Thank you.
Councilmember McIntosh.
And this is probably more of a comment than a question, but I think one of the other things that plays into this as a strategy to encourage people to provide more units, which is what we want, is that nationally the trend towards smaller housing units has been going on for some time. I think COVID has been a blip where that has reversed itself for a little bit. But as we try to accommodate more and more people living in the city of Winston-Salem, we really need to find ways to do that. And one of those ways is to encourage production on our transportation lines. So those things really dovetail together, and it does really track a long-term trend in what consumers want in housing, which is smaller units.
Councilmember Mundy.
Thank you. The question is, I understand that the density bonus is not highly utilized right now, but thinking in the future, if we do get to that point, what's not clear to me is if there's a 25% density bonus, is that 25% also subject to the same percentages of affordable housing as the original, the base, if you will?
Okay. Are you talking about the calculations, or are you asking if there have been changes to the UDO to those calculations?
I don't see any changes other than a few words. Everything
Right.
looks the same. But for instance, if you have 100 units and 60 of those or 40% of the units are at 60% of the median income, that's 40 units. So they would qualify for 25% more. Is that correct?
So how the calculations work, and we actually made this a little clearer in the UDO language because we realized that there was a discrepancy there and it could be interpreted a couple ways. So the example that we gave in our report was that if you had a 20 unit project and you wanted to apply for the bonus density, you could build an additional 5 units if you set aside 10 units at 60% AMI. So the calculation of the units is based on the new total of units. So you got
the new total.
Right. So you got a bonus of 5 units, and based on that new total, you had to make 10 affordable at 60% AMI. So, and
that new total does have to meet the same standards
Yes.
as the original one. That's the original base.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I needed to clarify.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Larson.
Regarding the parking, we're saying one automobile per unit now. What is the standard that we're moving off of? How many are we requiring currently?
It's based on the number of bedrooms, Councilmember Larson. It should be, I'm shooting from the hip on this. I want to say it ranges from 1.5, 1 3/4, and up to 2, depending on how many bedrooms you've got. Tiffany, am I close on that?
Yeah, that's right. So it goes from 1 parking spot for a studio, and then it goes 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and you need 2 parking spots for 3 bedroom or above. So that's in the parking reduction that we're suggesting, it would be 1 parking spot regardless of number of bedrooms or unit size.
So you could have teenagers with cars parking, and there's only one unit per whole family unit. We have 3 bedrooms. You could have a number of people living there with more than 1 vehicle. Is there a national standard for affordable housing grants and funding that dictates parking requirements? Are we the only ones that are we just creating a cellar here? Are we just creating a cellar floor as the lowest possible denominator in this?
No, I think, again, we're trying to find some strategies that make this solution a little bit of easier to kind of chew on and make this happen. And parking is one of those things. And when Tiffany was kind of going through her report earlier, she sort of kind of gave the juxtaposition of the Winston-Salem market versus some of these really big, fast-growing, expensive markets. Think, the Bay Area, think, Portland, think New York, and some of those areas where land is super cheap and there's a real need for density there. In a lot of those areas where you have transit, some of those areas are going to 0 parking spaces to really try to reduce that barrier and remove some of the costs. So we didn't feel that was appropriate to go down to 0 parking spaces and just leave that entirely up to the market. But what we did feel comfortable was, as Tiffany said, we don't want to be the barrier in requiring more parking than somebody may actually need. And that's why we felt comfortable under a defined geographic set of circumstances to go down to that 1 space. Again, as Tiffany said, there are going to be market factors where folks are going to need to understand how much parking they really need to have to lease these units. But staff felt comfortable under those geographic conditions to go down to that 1 space per unit.
And just adding what Aaron said, yeah, there were numerous instances or examples of bonus density for affordable housing projects allowing 0 parking per unit. And the closest one was Durham. There are places in Durham where if you do bonus density for affordable housing in their core area and you comply with the restrictions and regulations, you can go down to 0 parking units per affordable unit. And again, I don't think as staff didn't think that was good for our local market. But like Aaron said, we didn't want to be the barrier. So there are numerous examples of affordable housing that allows for 0 parking units within certain parameters.
And one of the things, excuse me, Mr. King, one of the things that we've been working on the city over the past 4 years is how do we get developers to build in certain parts of our city to create density. I was on a call the other day about affordable housing, and Councilmember McIntosh was on it with me. And the question was, about our transportation, our transit bus line. As some of you know, a few years ago, we changed up something here in the city that we hadn't done to my knowledge ever. We began to investigate our transit process and routes. And we changed the routes to start to try to get the buses to where the people are and where they work. Well, as developers continue to build out, we're gonna have to revisit that. It won't be that we will not look at our transit routes for decades like we did. We will have to be, diligent and looking at that situation of where developers are building housing and multifamily units, affordable and whatever. And we're gonna have to adjust those routes as we move forward for the people. Now, one of the things that keeps coming on, and Ms. Newman, Ms. Logan Ford and Community Development understand, and Mr. King, that the city of Winston-Salem, we are not like Durham and Raleigh and our other 4 major urban centers because they've been building density for a while. We haven't. And we got to get to that point. If we're going to build those 14 to 15,000 units over the next few years, we've got to start making it easier for developers. And as Ms. White said in her report, developers are telling us, that's not what that's not going to be a driver for me. But we've got to start benchmarking and looking at other things that cities are doing to try to help drive density in Winston-Salem, whether it's accessory dwellings, tiny houses, duplexes, triplexes. We've got to do that in order to understand our growing population. Ms. Vice Chair Scipio.
Yeah, I just have another concern just to raise, or maybe you can clarify this. With this parking reduction of 1 space per unit, is that being tied exclusively to affordable housing, and therefore we are creating an inequity for those who don't have funds to live in a better neighborhood? Or is this going to apply across the city so that people are going to be impacted throughout the city equally?
Ms. White.
It's not tied to affordability. There are places that do tie the parking reduction to the affordability of the unit, but in discussing it as staff, we found several challenges with that. One of which is, our local standards are that units are affordable for 15 years. Well, once it's no longer 15 years, it falls out of compliance. And this was really why we talked about making them 1 parking space across the board, as long as you were in growth corridors, activity centers, and within a 1/4 mile of transit. And this gets back to Mayor Pro Tem Adams' comment about we're looking at the areas where we want to drive this increase in housing. And we've had several UDO text amendments and programs coming through that really look at those growth corridors and really look at those activity centers as areas that we want to incentivize for development. And so that's why we tied it in. So it's not tied to affordability. It is tied to the locations. And another reason for encouraging them to be on growth corridors and activity centers is transit routes may change in the future, but those growth corridors and activity centers are the high traffic areas, and therefore there's less of a chance of the transit route going away from those. And so trying to encourage the long-term use of the transit and those corridors is why we tied that all together.
And as she was saying, if some of you remember not too long ago, we had the UDO on the commercial activity centers in the city, and we had to vote on where these areas would be. And of course, there were council members and others that didn't want it, but in the urban core of the neighborhoods that are those neighborhoods that need this growth, if you got the housing and you create the center, then you got a drugstore, a small grocer, dry cleaners, urgent care, and you put housing there, then and a bus line, transit that goes by, then people can live a quality of life without, in a walkable community. All of this, again, is built around what we're trying to create for the future of Winston-Salem. That's not, hopefully, there are going to be people that don't want things. We know that. But it's up to government to try to drive development in areas of our community that desperately need it, which drives transportation and transit lines there and other quality of life services that we need. Councilmember McIntosh.
I hear over and over again when cities are pitching the reasons to come live in their communities, and I hear it from my clients in the real estate business, walkability, access to be able to walk to a grocery store, walk to services, that's a mega trend that's not changing.
It's not.
That's been going on for some time now and will continue to go on. And if we don't provide the ability for developers to build increased density near activity centers, then we're missing the boat.
Councilmember Monday.
Generally speaking, would these developments end up in areas where there's on-street parking? So at least there is some possibility if someone has more than one vehicle that they can park within a reasonable quarter of a mile of their home. I'm not totally familiar with the existing infrastructures in the legacy growth area.
Yeah. Tiffany, I'll catch this one. Councilmember Mundy, typically our growth corridors, if you're thinking about those, and one as it relates to the Southwest Ward is Peters Creek Parkway. So obviously the Peters Creek Parkway, there's not going to be on-street parking there. If you think of other growth corridors, New Walkertown Road, University Parkway, Renolda Road, that just to name a few, that those are generally streets, given the nature of what their purpose is, which is to move traffic. You're generally not going to see on-street parking on those corridors themselves. In activity centers, there could be some additional on-street parking as you kind of get in some of those areas, but generally on your growth corridors, on the roadways themselves, you're not going to see that on-street parking there. And I would just also add, Councilmember Mundy, our zoning enforcement side, we field complaints from neighborhoods. I don't know that we've gotten a lot of complaints. I can't remember any complaints from any neighborhoods about existing multifamily developments where folks have called us and said, hey, they don't have enough parking, they're spilling out to the neighborhood. Now, we get that sometimes from businesses, from bars, restaurants, and some of those other sort of uses. But I can't remember in my 16 years getting a call about a residential development where there was not enough, a multifamily development where there was not enough parking on site to satisfy those needs.
Councilmember Larson.
I think that's exactly the point, is that up to this point, we have regulated maximum amounts of parking for these residential developments that are adjacent to other neighborhoods. And we haven't seen a spill out because there's been adequate parking places. I mean, I think my concern, we just approved, for example, in C1, the question of traffic impact studies to neighborhoods and other areas based on traffic patterns. And I'm all for choking down the automobile, don't misunderstand me. But in reality, I think you have more faith in the market than maybe I do about how people are going to give up their cars. The idea of if part of our traffic studies is going to be the number of parking spaces in the adjacent in this parking development, in this housing development that's going to be put in, and we're using this new restricted number of parking spaces, which is unrealistic based on the demand that's going to be placed there. I'm not convinced that the market is going to control the number of spaces. Developers are going to put in the minimum amount of spaces that are required for the housing units that they're putting in. It's what we're asking them to do. We're giving them an economic incentive to put in the minimum number of parking spaces that are required for any development. Now, are they going to, just because somebody's going to move in with 2 kids and has an extra car, to accommodate that, I'm not sure is realistic in this matter. And I need a little more explanation as to what kind of market study we really believe that 1 car per unit, regardless of the number of bedrooms involved, is going to be adequate, and how that's going to impact neighborhoods or traffic patterns when we're saying it's only 1 car per unit.
Yeah, Councilmember Larson, Mayor Pro Tem, if I can respond to that, if that's appropriate.
Go ahead.
Councilmember Larson, I guess I would just I think we've kind of got the glasses half full, glasses half empty discussion going on here. What I would say is I don't think if we say the parking standard is 1 per unit, that automatically developers are just going to do that. And my example to that to you is Chick-fil-A. Okay, we have a parking minimum standard in our UDO for restaurants. It's 1 space per 100 square feet. Okay. When Chick-fil-A comes in and builds a restaurant, they don't just put in 1 space per 100 square feet because they know their business model better than we do. And they basically put in nearly twice that many parking spaces because they know they need that. The reason they do it is because it makes sense on their business needs. They don't come in and just put in the minimum number of parking spaces just to save money. They know what they've got to do to make that work. And if you're investing in a residential development, a multi-million-dollar residential development, you're not going to come in and shortchange. You're likely not going to come in and shortchange yourself on the parking side and then not be able to rent the units out.
Yeah.
So again, we don't want to be the barrier. Just because it says that doesn't mean that these developments we built with just that 1 space per unit standard. It gives that person the ability to where, given their situation, if they look at the transit that's available and the proximity of their development, where they can look at it and say, you know what, no, based on our market demand that we've studied in far more depth than the city has studied, we can get by with 1 standard. We don't want to be the person standing in the way and saying, no, put in 2 per unit. So again, that's just a little bit of kind of big picture clarity on kind of the parking situation.
Thank you, Mr. King. Are there any more comments or questions? Again, the one thing that I want everyone to keep in mind, part of the responsibility of this committee is to further the development of housing in the community. And it's our responsibility to always look forward and be innovative and benchmark best practices. Again, when you start to look at and see all the studies that we've done over the past decade on why we're where we are as a city when it comes to density and housing of any type, whether it's market, affordable, workforce, income-based, senior housing, we are way more behind the 8 ball than any of the other 4 urban centers because, you know, we're different, we're unique, we're Winston-Salem. But it's our responsibility to look to the future of start to look forward as to how we're going to work collectively, collaboratively with the other stakeholders to advance the building of housing with density. You know, there'll be people that want their individual house, but the data is showing that most people would rather and can afford multi-family unit housing. And, you know, for some of our wards and areas in the city that's seen this for decades, on the north side in my ward, I have more multifamily density than anybody. And people come to the ward for that. And they're on major bus lines, transit. They work all over the city, the hospitals, whatever, but they do that. And I think that we have an opportunity with, as some of you know, over the 10 years, we asked staff to start to review and look at our UDOs because they hadn't been looked at really either, as to how do we move forward in trying to build a better community for our citizens as well as businesses and others in the city. Are there any other questions or concern on item G1? May we have a motion, please?
I move that we approve this and forward and move it forward.
And I will second.
It has been moved and properly seconded by Vice Chair Scipio and Councilmember Monday. We will now do the roll call vote. Councilmember Vice Chair Scipio,
Yes.
Councilmember Monday,
Aye.
Councilmember Clark, Council Mayor Pro Tem Adams, yes. So we have 3 yays and no abstentions or noes, and the motion passes. That is the end of our agenda of the last meeting of 2020 for the Community Development Housing General Government Committee. I hope everyone has a great holiday. Everybody, please be safe over the next 48 hours. We do not know what this storm is going to do. And again, I look forward to working with each and every one of you, and staff. Thank you so much for this past year and what you guys all had to do to help us be able to do our jobs. We thank you and applaud you. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Public Works.